Most people think the story of Israel and Iran starts with hatred, with missiles and nuclear threats, and decades of hostility splashed across the evening news. But if you go back to the Bible, the story doesn't start that way at all. It starts with a name, a specific name, written down by a prophet named Isaiah, approximately 150 years before the man it described ever drew his first breath. Isaiah 45:1 says this, and pay attention to how God phrases it. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, his anointed. That's the same word used for David, for the kings of Israel. God takes that word, that sacred, covenant-loaded word, and hands it to a Persian king who didn't worship him, didn't know him, and had no idea he was being written into scripture before he was even born. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, and the first thing he did, almost immediately, was issue a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to go home. He didn't just release them, he funded the rebuilding of the temple. He returned the gold and silver vessels Nebuchadnezzar had stolen. He treated Israel's God with more respect than most of Israel's own kings had. This is the land we now call Iran, and its first biblical appearance isn't as an enemy, it's as a deliverer. And that means God's relationship with this region is far more complex than the modern conflict suggests. It means he's moved through this land before, powerfully, purposefully, in ways that defied every human expectation. The hatred came later, but grace came first. And if you want to understand why the rivalry runs so deep, you have to start there, with a pagan king, a divine appointment, and a promise that God was already weaving through Persian soil long before anyone saw it coming. Here's where the story shifts. And it shifts fast. We're still inside the Persian Empire. Same land, same throne room, same world. But the king has changed. The atmosphere has changed, and a man named Haman has just been promoted to the highest office in the land. Esther 3:1 introduces him like this. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, like it's just a tribal surname. It's not. That word is a loaded weapon pointed directly at Israel's history. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites weren't just another ancient people group. They were the nation that attacked Israel from behind in the wilderness, targeting the weak, the exhausted, the ones who couldn't keep up. God's response in Exodus 17:16 was categorical. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Haman's hatred for Mordecai, and by extension every Jewish person in the empire, wasn't a personality conflict. It wasn't political rivalry. It was something older, something inherited at the bloodline level. When Mordecai refused to bow, Haman didn't just get offended. Esther 3:6 says he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone and sought to destroy every Jew throughout the entire kingdom. That's not anger, that's a generational mission. And yet, God's name never once appears in the book of Esther, not a single time. No burning bush, no angelic messenger, no parting sea. Just a young Jewish woman in the right place, a cousin with wisdom and courage, and a king who happened to have a sleepless night at exactly the right moment. God's fingerprints are all over this story. You just have to know where to look. What Haman intended as extinction, God turned into preservation. What looked like the end of Israel inside Persia became one of the clearest pictures of divine providence in all of Scripture. Haman thought he was making history. He was fulfilling it, just not the way he planned. To really understand where this rivalry comes from, you have to go back further than Haman, further than Persia, further than the exile. You have to go all the way back to a tent in the wilderness, two brothers and a bowl of stew that changed the trajectory of nations. Genesis 25:23, before Jacob and Esau are even born, before they have done anything good or bad, God tells their mother, Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. 2 nations, not 2 boys, 2 nations. Jacob receives the covenant, the blessing, the promise that runs all the way back to Abraham. Esau loses it, and the text doesn't let you feel good about that. Genesis 27:38 says Esau lifted up his voice and wept. That's not the cry of a man who doesn't care. That's the sound of a wound that would never fully close. Esau's descendants become Edom, and Edom becomes a recurring adversary threaded through Israel's entire history. blocking their path in Numbers 20, rejoicing when Jerusalem fell in Psalm 137, standing by while the city burned in Obadiah 111. The wound that started in one family metastasized across centuries. And here's the connection most people never make. The Amalekites, Haman's people, trace their lineage directly back to Esau's grandson Amalek in Genesis 36:12. The man who plotted genocide inside the Persian Empire was carrying a grudge that began in a tent thousands of years before he was born. That's not just ancient history, that's a warning. The bitterness we carry, the wounds we refuse to grieve and release, don't just affect us, they echo forward. They shape the people who come after us. They become inheritance when we meant them to be private. Esau sold his birthright in one impulsive moment, but the fracture that created between two brothers, two peoples, two destinies, is still reverberating today. And that fracture, the one that started with two brothers in a tent, didn't stay in one family. It spread. And if you trace it forward through the biblical map of nations, you'll find Persia sitting inside this story far earlier than most people ever realize. Most people don't realize how early Persia shows up in the Bible, not just in the exile period, not just in Daniel or Esther, all the way back to Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, where God lays out the families that will populate the earth after the flood. Genesis 10:22 lists the sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Elam is first on the list, and Elam is the ancient name for the region that becomes Persia, the heartland of modern Iran, which means the Persians aren't strangers to Israel's story. They're Semitic cousins, descended from the same son of Noah, part of the same original family tree that eventually produces Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the covenant people of God. And the prophets knew this region mattered. Isaiah 13:17 names the Medes as the instrument God would use to bring down Babylon. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them. Jeremiah 51:11 echoes it. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it. God was using Persian power as a tool of his own judgment long before Cyrus ever showed up. Then comes Daniel. In chapter 8, Daniel sees a vision of a ram with two horns, and the angel interprets it plainly in verse 20. The ram that you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. This empire isn't lurking at the edges of biblical prophecy, it's standing at the center of it. So when someone asks, where does Iran fit in the Bible? The answer isn't a footnote in Revelation. It's woven into the genealogies of Genesis, the judgments of the prophets, and the apocalyptic visions of Daniel. God didn't discover this region when the modern conflict started. He had already written it into the blueprint centuries before the first headline. A young man named Daniel, taken from Jerusalem as a teenager, stripped of his name, dropped into the heart of Babylon, and then transferred into the Persian system when Babylon falls, refuses to stop praying 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, window open, no apology, and the empire that surrounds him passes a law specifically designed to make that illegal. Daniel 6:10 says that when Daniel knew the decree was signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber, open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Daniel didn't escalate in defiance. He simply didn't stop. This is the pattern that runs through the entire biblical relationship between Israel and the Persian world. An empire rises, whether Babylon, Persia, or any successor, and it makes the same demand every empire eventually makes: ultimate allegiance. Bow to us. Recognize our authority as final. Let us define who you are. And the faithful remnant inside that empire keeps saying no. Ezra 4 shows us the shift inside Persia itself. Artaxerxes, a later Persian king, issues a letter halting the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. The protector is beginning to become the oppressor. The grace of Cyrus is fading. The empire is remembering what empires do. And yet, Daniel's God, the one Daniel prayed toward 3 times a day, outlasted every king who tried to silence him. Darius the Mede spent a sleepless night because of it. and in the morning his first words to the lion's den were a question, not a declaration. O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you? Daniel 6:20. The empire needed to ask. Daniel already knew the answer. Every generation faces its version of that empire. The names change, the pressure doesn't. And the question the empire always asks is the same one it asked Daniel: is your God actually enough? There's a verse in Exodus most people read once and then quietly move past, because if you stop and really hear what it's saying, it's uncomfortable. Exodus 17:16. Right after Israel's first battle with the Amalekites in the wilderness, Moses builds an altar and speaks a declaration over it. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, from generation to generation, not until the next king, not until the next battle, generation to generation. God himself declares an ongoing conflict, not because he's petty, but because of what the Amalekites represented, a force that specifically targeted the weak, the vulnerable, the ones who couldn't keep up. Deuteronomy 25:18 spells it out. They attacked from the rear, going after the exhausted and the struggling, showing no fear of God. Then comes 1 Samuel 15. God tells Saul to finish it completely. Saul almost does, but he keeps Agag alive. And Samuel's response in verse 23 is devastating. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. One act of incomplete obedience, and it costs Saul everything. But here's what most people never connect. Because Agag survived, even briefly, the Agagite line continued. And hundreds of years later, a man named Haman descended from that line, stood inside the Persian court, and plotted the extermination of every Jewish person in the known world. The incomplete obedience of one king echoed forward into a genocide attempt centuries later. That's not coincidence. That's consequence. And it raises a question worth sitting with. What incomplete obedience in our own lives, the thing we almost surrendered but held back, is still echoing forward? What Agag are we keeping alive that God already told us to release? The war God declared wasn't arbitrary. It was a warning about what happens when evil is accommodated instead of confronted. And the history of this rivalry between Israel and the Persian world is, in part, the long, painful evidence of what accommodation costs. But here's what makes this whole story stranger than it sounds. God was working inside that same Persian empire through the very people Haman was trying to destroy, and he did it without anyone seeing his hand until it was already finished. The book of Esther is 10 chapters long. God is never mentioned once, and that might be the most theologically rich detail in the entire Old Testament. Because the absence of God's name in Esther isn't an oversight. It's a literary choice that mirrors a spiritual reality many of us know intimately. The seasons when heaven feels silent, when no burning bush appears, when no angel shows up with instructions, and you're left wondering whether God is still in the room. He's in the room. Esther 4:14 is the hinge of the whole book. Mordecai speaks to Esther when she hesitates to approach the king. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther is a Jewish woman in a Persian court, hiding her identity, facing potential execution if she approaches the king uninvited, watching a genocide decree circulate through 127 provinces. And Mordecai's message is essentially, God will win this either way. The question is whether you'll be part of how he does it. That's not a prosperity promise. That's a call to costly obedience. Esther fasts for 3 days. She gathers her people. She walks into that throne room not knowing if she'll walk out, and the king extends his scepter, and everything turns. What looked like the final chapter of Israel inside Persia became the story of Purim, still celebrated by Jewish people today. The empire's best weapon, a written decree sealed with the king's ring, was overcome not by military power, but by one woman's courage and God's invisible coordination of 1,000 ordinary moments. That's how God tends to work. Not always with the dramatic and the obvious, more often with the quiet, the hidden, the person nobody expected. Haman's gallows ended up holding Haman. That's the kind of irony that belongs to God alone. Step back from all of it for a moment. Esau and Jacob, Haman and Mordecai, Cyrus and Daniel, the Amalekite thread, Esther's courage in a Persian throne room. Step back and ask the question underneath all the questions. What is this rivalry actually about? Because if you read it as a political conflict, you'll keep looking for a political solution. If you read it as ethnic tension, you'll trace bloodlines and miss the point entirely. But if you read it the way the Bible reads it, as a spiritual contest running beneath the surface of human history, something becomes very clear very fast. Genesis 12:3. God speaks to Abraham and says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Every empire that has raised its hand against Israel has raised its hand against that covenant. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. And the line of opposition that runs from Amalek through Haman through the modern posture of Iran's leadership. It's all the same hand, raised against the same promise. The names on the jersey change. The mission never does. That's not politics. That's ancient spiritual warfare, wearing the clothes of current events. And the Bible doesn't leave us guessing about how this ends. Ezekiel 38, written 2,600 years ago, while Ezekiel was sitting in Babylonian exile, describes a coalition of nations marching against a regathered Israel in the latter days. And in verse 5, one name appears that requires zero translation, zero scholarly debate, zero ancient language expertise. Persia, named directly by name. Listed among the nations that come against Israel in the final chapter of history. The nation Ezekiel named is the same nation currently making Israel's elimination an explicit foreign policy declaration. You don't have to force that connection. It's sitting in the text waiting for anyone willing to look. But here's what the Bible never lets us forget. And this is the part that should settle something deep inside you. Every single empire that has made Israel's destruction its central mission has eventually collapsed. Egypt still exists, but not as a world power. Babylon is an archaeological dig. The Persian Empire fell to Greece. Greece fell to Rome. Rome fell to time. Israel is still here. That's not a political statement. It's a prophetic one. God said in Jeremiah 31:35-36 that Israel would cease to be a nation only when the sun, moon, and stars stop functioning. He literally tied the survival of Israel to the survival of the cosmos itself. That's how serious the covenant is. So when you watch the news and see this ancient rivalry playing out in satellite footage and breaking alerts, missiles, proxies, nuclear negotiations, regional alliances shifting overnight, remember what you're actually watching. You're watching the oldest promise in human history refusing to break. You're watching the God of Abraham still standing behind the word he gave in a tent under desert stars to one man who had no children yet and no land to stand on. Cyrus freed Israel and didn't fully know why. Haman tried to end Israel and didn't understand what he was actually fighting against. Esther stepped into a throne room terrified and became part of a story she could never have written herself. Daniel prayed with his window open, knowing the lions were waiting, and walked out the next morning while the empire stood silent with its mouth open. None of them saw the whole picture. They were each living inside one chapter of a story God had already finished writing. And so are we. The rivalry is real. The threat is real. The tension you feel when you watch the headlines is not paranoia, it's discernment. Something ancient is moving underneath the modern conflict. Something that was named in Genesis, traced through the prophets, and placed by Ezekiel into the final act of history. But so is the promise. And in every generation since Abraham, through every empire, every Haman, every lion's den, every exile, every attempt to erase what God declared permanent, the promise has outlasted the threat. It still will.